represents Kentucky's 3rd congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's now in his 3rd term. He was selected to the Committee on Budget, the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, and the Committee on Ethics. In Congress, Congressman Yarmuth has fought for better quality and access in education and health care while working to help small businesses compete in a global economy and expand individual opportunities for success. He has enacted the largest funding increase for veterans' health care in American history, supporting a new GI Bill which guarantees a 4-year education for our veterans, and has secured $75 million to build our new VA hospital. I suspect there'll be a question about that. He has partnered with Ford and GE to revitalize manufacturing in Louisville and create thousands of local jobs, and John has been named Best of Congress by Working Mother magazine in each of his 3 terms in Congress. Before Louisville elected into Congress, John worked in education and healthcare, founded and ran successful small businesses, including Leo, Louisville's free weekly newspaper. He's a Louisville native, an Atherton alum, a father to Aaron, a 30-year husband to Kathy. Without further ado, Congressman John Yarmuth.
Thank you all very much. It's great to be back at Rotary. Before I begin my remarks, in the spirit of the birthday song, I am proud to be able to present to downtown Rotary a flag that is flown over the United States Capitol. I'm going to read the certificate that accompanies it. This is to certify that the accompanying flag was flown over the United States Capitol on July 23rd, 2012. At the request of the Honorable John Yarmuth, Member of Congress, this flag was flown in honor of the Rotary Club of Louisville's 100th anniversary and their century of service to our community. Thank you very much. As I said, it's great to be here again. It's always an honor to speak to Rotary, and I always enjoy the dialogue. In the spirit of bipartisanship, I was going to wear my McConnell-Yarmuth campaign button from 1981. I didn't figure anybody would buy that, so trying to leave it off. I know the purpose of my appearance here today is to discuss what's happening in Congress. And I also know that I'm supposed to speak for at least 20 minutes, so I'm trying to figure out how to fill all that time. Actually, I might get Woody back up here. Because as you know, despite a lot of people who are trying to move things along, Congress isn't doing anything right now. There are 5 weeks left in the calendar between now and the election, and last week House leadership adjourned, so we're closed for all of those 5 weeks. Other than funding the government for the rest of this year, current levels for 6 months to keep the government operating, we left with the country's problems on the table. So let's fast forward to November 13th, when we will return to Washington for the lame duck session, which I believe will be one of the most interesting few weeks in the history of Congress. The main attraction, of course, will be the fiscal cliff. You've all heard of the fiscal cliff. It involves 2 things. One is what's called sequestration. This is an across-the-board cut of 9% in all federal spending except Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. It's the result of legislation that was passed in 2011 called the Budget Control Act. I can't believe that anybody thought that was a good idea. I voted against it, understanding, I think, full well what would happen, that we would end up in this spot trying to undo the mandatory cuts that were prescribed in that legislation. Also, on January 1st, all the Bush tax cuts from 2001 and 2003 expired. We have proposed, the Democrats, to extend those tax cuts for everyone making up to $250,000. This includes 98% of the American people and 97% of small business owners. But as reasonable as that might sound, and as widespread support as that proposal has, polls off the charts, a huge majority, there are 2 words to explain why we can't get that done. Grover Norquist. You might ask who the hell that is. He is head of Americans for Tax Reform, and he was able to convince nearly every Republican in Congress and a few Democrats to sign a pledge, apparently in blood, that they will never vote to raise taxes under any circumstances. As far as I know, Grover Norquist has never gotten a vote from anybody, not one. But for some reason, he's holding the sword over all the Republicans' head. This has prevented us from compromising on an approach to deficit reduction. We've agreed, Democrats have, to pretty sizable spending cuts in exchange for increases in revenue. We've had a number of proposals up, but we've actually as much as 5-to-1 cuts for increases in revenue, and down to 2.5-to-1. We've been willing to compromise to no avail. As a matter of fact, I was on the Budget Committee. I introduced an amendment to the Ryan budget to restore the highest rate, 39.6, from the Clinton years to incomes over $1 million, and not one Republican voted for that. To put it in perspective, allowing the Bush tax cuts for the richest 2% to expire reduces the deficit by $930 billion over 10 years. So that's kind of where we are on coming to an agreement, kind of the grand bargain, as it's called. Republicans really can't break their pledge, and I wish they would have a better argument than some guy named Grover told me I couldn't. Anyway, they came up with a talking one. One of the rationales that Republicans use to avoid making this deal is that raising taxes on the top 2% will cost jobs. And this is something that is repeated time and time again by my colleagues on the other side and a lot of people on Fox News. And I think it really requires some exhaustive analysis. First, we're talking about individual tax rates, as you know. Many small business owners pay taxes as individuals. But as I said before, 97% of them would not be impacted because they take home less than $250,000 per year. Now, you will hear many people say, I don't know if Senator McConnell said this when he was here recently, but I've heard him say it dozens of times. They say, if you raise taxes on small business owners, you will, on people making over $250,000, you will raise taxes on 40% of small business income. I know some of you have heard that statistic. Now think about what they're saying, because this actually undoes the argument. They're talking about 40% of small business income, but that 40% of small business income is earned by the top 3% of small businesses. So 40%. This is not 40% of small business owners. This is our small businesses. This is 40% of the income, which means what we're talking about are hedge funds, big law firms, a lot of people who make a lot of money. Those are the ones who would be impacted by the proposal to eliminate the Bush tax cuts for that top 2%. Now, here's the impact. And I was a small business owner. As many of you know, my brothers were small businesses and now they're running larger businesses. My sister's a small business person. If you have somebody who's making $300,000 a year after paying all their expenses, this is profit, right? What they take home. If you extend the Bush, if you repeal the Bush tax cut for that top 2%, they would pay 4% more on $50,000 worth of income. In other words, they pay $2,000 more in taxes. Now, if you gave them that tax break, a lot of small business people here, if you gave that person a $2,000 tax break, are they going to go out and hire a $30,000 employee or a $50,000 employee because you gave them $2,000 more? Of course not. It doesn't make sense. Conversely, why would you refuse to hire somebody if the business was there just because your taxes are going up $2,000? Now, you might ask the question, why would we raise taxes at all? And this is where we get to item number one of my new plan to tell, whenever I speak, to tell somebody something that they probably don't know. I'm going to have two of those today. Now, you've heard these statistics too. You say, well, 1% of the population pays 36% of the income tax. You've heard this, kind of a version of that from Governor Romney when he's talking about 47% don't pay any income tax. Yes, 1% of Americans pay 36% of the income tax. But the income tax is only 47% of all the federal revenues. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers around, I apologize for that. 47% of federal revenues. So, what the 1% pays is actually 17% of all federal revenues. 36% of 47% is 17%. What percentage of all income does the top 1% make? 17%. So they're paying exactly right now in terms of the overall percentage of income and tax and federal revenues that they earn. What compounds the argument, at least reinforces the argument, is that from 2009 to 2011, 93% of all new income in the country, all additional income, went to the top 1%. So when you're trying to figure out a balanced approach to reducing the deficit, that requires, you look at the income side, and as Willie Sutton said, you go where the money is. The very wealthiest Americans have done very well over the last few years. Everyone else's income has declined. Now, to extend that to the top 5%, just for the sake of argument, top 5% paid 58% of all federal income tax, which is 27% of all federal revenues, and they earn, the top 5% earns 32% of all the income. So we've got a great disparity, a growing disparity in the amount of income that is earned by the small percentage at the top of the income scale. And if we're going to try to deal with our deficit, we have to look to that segment of the population, which is what President Obama has proposed and what we've proposed as well in Congress. Now, I'm sure you heard Mitch McConnell say, because I've heard him say this 100 times, we don't have an income problem, a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. Well, let me give you, this is my second things you probably didn't know. If you go back historically to the Johnson administration, and you track the increase in spending, percentage increase in spending during each administration, here's what you get. The second LBJ administration, so 65 to 69, 55% increase. The first Nixon administration, 34%. The second Nixon administration, 67%. The first Carter administration, 65%. The first Reagan administration, 39%. The second Reagan administration, 20%. The first and only George Herbert Walker Bush administration, 23%. The first Clinton administration, 13%. The second Clinton administration, 16%. The first George Walker Bush administration, 32%. The second Bush term, 41%. The Obama administration, 8%. That's right. Federal spending has increased 8% over 4 years under President Obama, from the first year to the last. It's the smallest increase in federal spending of any administration since Kennedy.